welcome Discovery Club members. I'm Kelly Barber. I'm the Land Stewardship Coordinator with Barnstable Land Trust. Sorry that we couldn't do this in person, but hopefully this will suffice, and we're happy to field questions at the end. I'll try to answer everything that I can. I'm still relatively new. I started about just a little over a year ago. So I'm still getting to know a lot of our properties and the wildlife and plants that we support. But I think we'll give you a nice tour today and hopefully encourage you to come and visit in the future. So we're at our Barnstable Land Trust Conservation Center. And we're at the trail in the back behind our office. Some of you may know that our office used to be the Crystal Pineapple. But some more significant history for here is this used to be the home of the West Barnstable Brick Company, and the trail that we have here are all the old cart paths used to access the clay deposits to make the bricks, and also go out to beyond the train tracks to the brick factory. So we're going to do a little tour with some stops along the way, talk about some of what's protected here. This is sensitive wildlife habitat, so this trail in particular, we don't really allow dogs, just to protect the bird species here, and also when you're walking, just be very mindful and try to have kind of a quiet, mindful experience, just to not disturb the wildlife. And reflection, so we hope that this is a good space to provide you with that. But let's go take a walk. So on our first stop, we have a little patch here with some milkweed that we're supporting. So just to point out the milkweed. So not everything in here is milkweed, but what we do to support the milkweed is every now and again we come in and we whack some of the invasive plants around that. And I'll go into that a little bit, but for those of you that don't know, milkweed is a native plant, and it is also what's called a host plant for monarch butterflies and caterpillars. So what that means is milkweed is an essential part of the monarch butterfly life cycle. Monarch butterflies will feed on milkweed nectar and other plant nectar, but their eggs and caterpillars and chrysalises, they can only lay that, and the caterpillars can only eat milkweed. Milkweed is a very popular and well-known host plant, but there are a lot of other native host plants for a wide variety of other butterflies and moth species that are all really essential to our environment and to biodiversity and the whole web and ecosystem of the food chain. And so a lot of people have incorporated milkweed into their gardens. So considering that there is a wide variety beyond that, maybe you'll take some time to think about how else you can incorporate native plants into your garden, especially these kinds of host plants. And a thought on host plants too is, when we talk about host plants and incorporating it into your garden, we're thinking about supporting birds as well. We think about supporting nesting areas and bird food, and we tend to think about berries, but birds don't need berries in order to feed their young. They need caterpillars and worms. So if we're able to support that in our own gardens, then that's great. We're playing a bigger role in our ecosystem. So we'll keep going, and I'll talk about invasive plants a little bit. So part of my role as the land stewardship coordinator is not just taking care of our trails and putting up trails for the public, but we also work on actually taking care of the land and supporting the wildlife and native plants that we protect through our land protection. When I say invasive plants, that term can get thrown around a lot, but when ecologists say that, they really mean non-native and aggressive plants. So I hear poison ivy referred to as invasive, but it is a native plant, and it can be a little aggressive, but it does play a role in our ecosystem, even though we might not like it ourselves, especially for those of us sensitive to it, including myself. It's important to recognize that it does play a role. It provides berries for birds. It probably provides other roles that I might not be aware of at the moment. But it's important to not just completely eradicate poison ivy if we don't like it. Just maybe be selective about spots that you frequent. It's important to recognize where we might encounter it if we're sensitive to it, but it doesn't mean that it's a bad plant. So when I talk about invasive plants, they're plants that were brought here. A lot of them were brought here in the mid-1800s because we either thought that they looked nice and should be put into our gardens, or we recognized them from Europe or from China as an herb that we normally incorporate into kind of like our medicinal cabinet and into cooking. And at the time, it was either not recognized, the risk of bringing these plants here, or we didn't put as much importance on native species at the time either. So bush honeysuckle, for example, there are a few species of native honeysuckle, but most honeysuckle that you do see is a non-native species. This is bush honeysuckle, and even though it's like very pretty and does provide some nectar, going back to host plants, we don't have any species of caterpillar that's adapted to require this plant. So it's overcrowding this space, as you can see, and so we just think about, okay, well what could be here if the honeysuckle wasn't here, and all that the honeysuckle is providing is like maybe some nectar, maybe some berries, maybe some nesting habitat, but not much more beyond that. It's not supporting these caterpillars that really need their essential host plant in order to survive, so it's not providing that bird food, especially for nesting young. So just thinking about that as you're walking through the woods, and as you can see, there's a ton of honeysuckle here, over here, and that's not just the one invasive plant that's here. There's a few others in here, and they tend to kind of work together to take over an area. So it's a big job, but if we pick at it little by little over time and do some native plant support, such as what we're doing here, then maybe we can support more wildlife and native species over time. So we'll keep going. I just wanted to point out a native plant that we have here. We do have a variety of native plants here as well. I know that you can see a lot of invasives here. We're still seeing plenty of honeysuckle. But recognizing what native plants we have here and trying to support them where they are is a good way to kind of use our time well in land stewardship, especially with our volunteers, and just slowly maybe clip away and give these native plants some space. So this is Mayapple, and why it's called Mayapple is because, you know, we're coming to about the end of May and it's producing this edible apple at the end here. It is edible, but again, with like any sort of native edible plants especially, for one, you want to make sure you know what the plant is first before you start picking things, and two, it is a native plant, so you don't want to really rob wildlife of that edible plant. Like, there are a few Mayapples in here, so you don't want to pick every single one. You can maybe pick one because it only produces the one, but you know, just if you're into wild foraging, just be very mindful. Like, blueberry bushes are going to provide a lot more fruit than this Mayapple will, so just be very conscientious if you are doing any sort of edible foraging. But keep an eye out for these. I think it flowered already. I missed it when it flowered, but yeah, just keep an eye out for kind of like the neat plants growing along the ground. It's not all the trees and bushes, but if you look low to the ground too, you'll see some neat stuff. This is a birch tree, so just wanted to point out a native tree. I'm not sure what type this one is. I think it might be a river birch, but it might be wrong. But how I can tell it's a birch tree is first by looking at the leaves. They're very toothy and kind of triangular. It might be a gray birch. And then I look at the bark too. It's got a lot of horizontal striations. It's a little peely. But it's a beautiful native tree, and we do have several native trees in here that are unfortunately getting taken over by invasives, but again, with time we can work on that. So we reached this fork here. We did this project in the fall where we put in a viewing platform and a boardwalk. So this is a short path that leads to our viewing platform to overlook the pond. And this path is slightly longer. Altogether, our trails amount to like 0.2 miles, so really not long at all. So it's not a very long walk to just cover the area. But I'll talk about the process for that project later when we get to it. But for now too, whenever, again, as I said at the beginning, whenever you're visiting here, especially during the summer, just try to be very mindful, soft feet as you're stepping along, because the sensitive birds that we talked about might be resting here, so you just want to make sure, especially when you're walking up the platform, that you're walking fairly quietly. So we'll talk about the pond here. So this is actually a man-made pond, kind of an accident, but when we think about the wildlife that's supported here, it's kind of nice that it happened in the end. So West Barnstable has a lot of clay deposits in it. That's why this was such an attractive space for the brick company. And so they were here from the late 1870s to the early 1920s, and why that company closed, unfortunately, was because their clay pit here, they accidentally compromised it. In the 1920s, they did a test pit after they had already been digging up clay for a while. And when they were drilling down, they found that they were going to be able to sustain themselves with clay for another 50 years probably, but unfortunately, during the test drill, they punctured the bottom of the clay, and the clay pit was suppressing the aquifer, which is where our groundwater is, and there was enough pressure there from the aquifer to come up. This is what's called an artesian well in geology terms, and so then their entire clay pit filled up with water. So that was very unfortunate for the West Barnstable Brick Company, but as you'll see, if the birds return in a month or so, this is great for wildlife because now it's another open water source. We have great egrets, snowy egrets, crowned night heron that roost here, and they do flush easily, so that's why we want to be very sensitive and quiet when they're here. But there's a kingfisher that hangs out here. I saw some wood ducks the other day. There's otter here. So just thinking about, like, even though the company had to end because they weren't able to recover from this loss, it did end up providing something very special for wildlife. Orenda Wildlife, the organization Orenda recognized how special this was, and so they did the first protection of the property. And then when we moved into our office, we did a little bit of a land protection swap, so that's how we got this parcel here. And we had some other parcels that were more wild, and so we did a little bit of an exchange, so then everything remained protected, but then we could do more support to support the trail that's here, provide this viewing platform and the boardwalk, and support engagement of this space and mindful presence. So we'll continue walking. Here's another birch tree. Poison ivy here, and so I just wanted to point that out. It's mid-May, so poison ivy isn't totally green yet, but it's been popping out recently and pretty quickly. So it's looking a little red, and the consistent thing about poison ivy is its leaves of 3. But poison ivy doesn't look identical to each other all the time. You might see a little bit more lobes on this side where it's kind of curvy. You might see it be completely smooth edge like this one. It won't always look oily either. And soon enough it'll probably all start looking green. So it'd be nice if poison ivy was always consistent and easy to identify. But the main thing for me for how I identify is just like how smooth the surface will look. Because you have raspberry and it'll be really ridgy, really toothy on the outside, and where the veins come out, it'll just be deeper. This is not poison ivy, but like this has kind of got some deeper ridges, whereas poison ivy is a little more smooth. I mean, it took me some time to really get confident in identifying poison ivy all throughout the year, especially in the winter, so it can take a little bit of practice if you're not familiar. But the common saying is leaves of 3, let them be, because it could be poison ivy. But just wanted to point that out to you in case it was helpful, and then you kind of know a little bit of what to look for when you're here. And it'll travel along the ground too, so keep an eye on the ground, but it can get pretty tall and climb up trees. Another thing is it's not always hairy. A lot of people look for the hairy stem. They're like, I don't see much hair here, and this is poison ivy. So I also wanted to point out this plant. So this is skunk cabbage, and it might not look like a cabbage, but if you look at the leaves, it can look a little cabbagey. And this plant is pretty much our early indicator of spring when the flowers come up. The flowers can look really weird. They're kind of this like deep purple, pink, magenta, and sort of look like a little cone in the ground. It doesn't smell great, which is why it's called skunk cabbage. But you know, keep an eye out for that. They tend to like wetland areas, so that's why they're all in here, because it's a bit wetter. If you look here, it doesn't look wet right now, but the very dark patch is an indicator that that's where water is settling and collecting. So that's why it's no surprise that the skunk cabbage is in there, along with all these ferns. Sorry, I think I'm just staring at plants like I do. I think that this is poison ivy, so there's some times where I get a little less confident with plant ID. Yeah, it is poison ivy. So here's a good one where it's more like a poison ivy tree. Sometimes poison ivy will just come right out at you. There's the leaves. So just watch out for that. And again, there's not much hair along here. It's kind of this pale gray along here. The younger shoots will be more like a light grayish brown, but when it's branching out and much larger like this, you can see here's the hairy branches, but I think that this might be it too. This might be just like a massive, I might be wrong about that. That might be bittersweet, but it can get confusing. Bittersweet can get massive. Bittersweet's another invasive plant. It's a horrible vine and not fun. But it was brought here again as an ornamental because it's got really attractive berries. We do have a native bittersweet, and it's really easy to tell between the two because the invasive bittersweet is gigantic and will climb all the way up trees, and our native bittersweet will grow like this tall, and that's it. And I've never seen it in person because we mostly have invasive bittersweet everywhere. There's some lovely ferns growing here. Sometimes when you're walking around, you'll see some things that maybe don't completely belong, and those can be kind of fun because, like, you know, this plant and this plant, they're probably dwarf varieties of some sort of pine and I think a spruce. And even this rhododendron, you don't really see any others around here. So that's kind of an indication that these were planted here. So again, like the car paths that we're walking on, here's some remaining evidence of the human presence here. So that can be kind of fun to look out for. Like if you see lilacs around, those were definitely planted. We don't have any here, but some other properties we have, like Eagle Pond and Bell Farm, you'll see some lilacs that have been planted in the past. So we've reached our boardwalk. We have two long boardwalk sections to pass through some wetter areas on the trail. And that's why we put them here, because otherwise you'd like maybe be up to here in water, which might not be a great experience. But also when we're walking through the mud, we're disturbing wetland areas and kicking up silt, which can fill in the wetlands and disturb aquatic insect habitat. So the boardwalk was put in to be helpful towards that, both for visitors but also to reduce disturbance to the wetland area. So both for the platform and the boardwalk section, we did a long one here and a long one that we'll get to on a straightaway that used to lead to the old brick factory. And we had to go through the Conservation Commission through a permitting process, and we submitted what's called a notice of intent, which is the higher level of permit, since the platform and the boardwalk was going to require a little bit more of disturbance because we were setting in posts. There's another permit that's a little less intensive a process called a request for determination of applicability, and that's a little simpler for stuff like vista pruning or invasive plant management that might just be more clipping. But we submitted it in late summer, and it was a fairly easy process. You have to submit to both the state and the Conservation Commission, and we worked together on that for a long time. And then all of it got put together in October and November with the help of AmeriCorps Cape Cod members and volunteers. So it was a collaborative effort and kind of exciting and a real learning process for us. This long section here, we had initially asked for just 3 small sections, but they were so close together with some wet areas in between that just made sense to do the whole thing. So we had to submit a revised plan to the Conservation Commission, and they approved. So, and then we put it in place. So right now we've got these straw wattles along the sides, and we're leaving them there for now in coordination with the Conservation Commission to help support the regrowth of vegetation, because when we were walking around putting this in, we were there's a little bit of trampling of vegetation happening, so we're trying to just support the regrowth of the plants in here, and also reduce any sedimentation or sediments that might get kicked up from water flowing down. So we'll continue on. This is a bit more of a straighter section, and this led out beyond the train tracks to the brickyard factory. And where that's located right now is on protected land owned by Arenda, and again, it's very sensitive, so they don't really want people venturing out there. It's a very popular birding spot, but just be respectful of that and appreciate from a distance along this trail here. So we'll continue walking. We'll see the next section of boardwalk, and then we'll get to our other kind of pond viewing area. So pointing out another native plant. So this here that's coming out is wild grape. I think we have both fox grape and Concord grape. And the leaves will get really big, and so you can use the leaves for like your normal Greek dishes, like grape leaf wrapped whatever rice.
Dolmas, yeah.
Okay. But you can also eat the grapes. They aren't seedless like our grapes, and they can be kind of tart, but these will be popping out late summer, so you can pick along the way. And as I said with the May apple, you want to be conscientious when you're picking native food that's available for wildlife. But because it's grapes and they produce a lot more, you can do a bit more mindful picking, and it's not going to rob the entire plant. So that's the railroad. We did not plan that. They're doing some brush maintenance along the railroad, and they worked along this the other day, and it was really, really loud. I thought that someone was like in the wetlands, so the trash train comes by here every morning around like 8:30, 9 o'clock, and then also around 4 in the afternoon. So that can be a bit noisy if you don't want that disturbance. But again, with grapes, since they'll produce a lot, you can like do a little bit of picking here and there. It's not like the May apple where there's just the one. So this is one where I say there's a little bit more permission to pick. If you look down, it doesn't look like there's, you can actually see a little bit. That's just mucky. So there's some iron deposits here, that's why it's orange. Like when you see rust, it's from iron reacting with oxygen. And so during the winter and early spring, this was really, really wet in here, so it might not look like the boardwalk is doing much while we're here now, but it is really helpful during the winter and spring when it's really wet out. I want to point out this plant. So this is, you'll see more of this when it grows taller, but this is jewelweed or touch-me-not, and I've heard that it can be helpful if you break the stem. It can help with poison ivy itch and stinging nettle reactions, and it's another plant that really likes wet areas, so that's why we see it in here a bit more. It'll put out this really cool like orange yellow flower, so that's something to look forward to. And seeing the bricks there, when we were putting these in, we were finding bricks left and right, so that's further evidence of the brickyard being here. We have cattail, this is native. Just a little bit of time to point out the sumac here. So we have different varieties of native sumac. Poison sumac is native too, but this is staghorn sumac, and how you can tell the difference is staghorn sumac will kind of gather in a group like this is now, whereas poison sumac tends to be more solitary and you just see one. Another thing with staghorn sumac is its fruit will be like a red cone that stands upright, whereas poison sumac will just have drooping white berries from the top, so that's a telltale difference between the two as well. This is great for birds. You'll see them feeding off of this in the fall and winter because those berries will just still stick around. And again, this is native. A lot of people see it as a nuisance plant because it will sucker out and spread, but it is native and helpful and supportive. So I just wanted to point that one out in case there was a question with that. You can use the berries and make kind of like a sumac lemonade, if you will. But they are very fuzzy, so you want to make sure that you use something fine in order to squeeze out the juice so you don't get the hairs because they can be a little irritating. But that can be kind of fun. So we reached about the end of our trail, but if you look over there, you can see our resident osprey nest. They come back every year, so it's kind of exciting and something that we look forward to. We have a scope in Janet and Jean's office, so they keep an eye on them. But this is another nice, enjoyable spot. I think I accidentally disturbed some wood ducks another time from here, so they really like hanging out in the brush on the edges of the pond and the wetland that we passed before. And if we take some time to be quiet and enjoy nature and have some observation. It's really peaceful back here. So thank you very much for taking a little walk with us, and we hope that you take some time at some point to enjoy this place on your own. Yeah, we're happy to field any questions. If you want to reach out to me with any questions or thoughts you have, you can feel free to. But yeah, thank you very much for taking the time and spending this time with us.